please.
Venton Cook of the Pilgrim Church here. I wanted to ask Professor Strawson whether he thinks the Taliban of Afghanistan and Pakistan are an extreme closed political religious group, or something more or less, or something else.
Well, yes, thanks for the question. These organizations, all these organizations you might talk about, the Taliban is a very good one, is extremely broad in terms of why people are part of it. And to be quite frank, the reason that the Taliban in Afghanistan is as strong as it is today is not because of Islamic identity, it's to do with foreign troops in Afghanistan. It's largely a movement which has been fueled by the kind of conflict which has existed in Afghanistan. I'm not talking about the initial invasion, but I'm talking about the continuation of the war after the end of the first year. So first of all, it's a heterogeneous organization. Its ideology, if one reads Mullah Omar, who is its leader, and who, of course, who was the head of the Emirate of Afghanistan, which was overthrown in 2001, his approach to the world is very much one of this narrow focus of political Islam. He develops his ideas in reaction to what he thinks is the course of history. He does believe that the Islamic world is beleaguered, that the Islamic world is ruled by corrupt, fake Muslims, and so on and so forth. And he has an extremely narrow view of what he thinks Islam is in society. As is well known, one of the main aims of the Taliban in Afghanistan was to remove women from the public sphere. And one of its particular ideas was to prevent all women's education. This would mean, for instance, that women could not be treated by male doctors, they could be treated by female doctors, but eventually there would be no female doctors, and therefore women would not receive medical attention. This is entirely contrary to the values of Islam, because women had rights and have rights within Islam long before women gained rights within the West. There's a very interesting introduction to a translation of an Islamic legal text in the 18th century, where the editor and translator Hamilton says, "The reader, the European reader, will be very shocked by the number of immunities and privileges granted to women," which is true. Islam is very keen, as in the Prophet's last sermon, very keen on gender equality, on the promotion of education for women, on the involvement of women in all areas of life. And I think that's something which has been lost, and the whole stream of Islamic feminism, which is now trying to return to the real roots of Islam, that it's not Islam which is anti-women, it's male patriarchy which is anti-women, is extremely important. So I think from that point of view, the Taliban in Afghanistan and its leadership is extremely problematic and very narrow.
A bit of a different tack. Rowan Steele. I thank the speakers for their encouragement to us all about improving relations personally with people of other faiths, and particularly Muslims tonight. I wanted to, it struck a chord with me, this idea that we haven't had good institutional relationships between Western institutions and Islamic ones in Australia, and I wondered whether what ideas the panel might have in terms of improving those relationships.
We probably need to do some radical things, I think. One of the things I'd like to see is that all of the uniting theological colleges extend the hand of friendship to a Muslim tertiary education and the Jewish community, and say, we've got a bit of block of land here, extra land. Let's have a theological colleges that have a Christian section, an Islamic section, and a Jewish section, with a common room in the middle where students can gather and meet. And I have to say that over my 15 years, it's been embarrassing when students from other faiths have said that they would like to study theology and the only thing they can do is Christian theology.
Fantastic ideas on this. I mean, I think, there's a story that I always comes back to me, and this was in Philadelphia where I went to seminary, and there was a meeting between rabbis and African American Christian ministers. And this was quite something because such a meeting hadn't happened in a long time. And the rabbis met with these ministers, and they said, "Oh, it's so wonderful to meet you. We'd love to learn about your gospel traditions, and your spirituality is so deep and from the heart. What can you tell us about this?" And the African American minister said, "We could really use some direct donations to our emergency feeding programs." And the lesson there is that you need to look where the needs are, I think. And I'm actually not familiar enough with where the direct needs are in the Muslim community in Adelaide. I mean, once I've seen a point of contact has been, we've had now, unfortunately, 2 services of lament here in this sanctuary in the last 2 years to lament asylum seekers who've been lost at sea. And the first one was really quite extraordinary because there was a group of young Hazaras who set up a TV studio over here in the corner and interviewed us participants to find out why we had decided to advocate on behalf of the rights of asylum seekers. And so I think that's an area of need, and so that's probably a good initial point of contact.
A national dialogue between the National Council of Churches and the Australian Federation of Islamic Councils and the Executive Council of Australian Jewry, so that there is actually national dialogues going on. And their purpose is to provide opportunities for the national bodies of each faith to come together to build understanding and harmony in the Australian context. So some of their conversations about things that we have in common, thematic, theological concepts, but they've also, on occasions when the need has arisen, to issue joint statements of solidarity where there's situations in Australia of intolerance and non-acceptance. So there is national dialogues going on in terms of a national conversation.
Well, just to say that I think one of the issues is thinking about it is lessons from Palestine and the occupied territories. What I've always found interesting is that there's a natural inter-community relations over, for instance, festivals, where it's normal for Muslims to go to Christian homes at Christmas time and for Christians to go to iftar parties during Ramadan as a normal thing. I think what that highlights is it's not just to do with institutional relations at a formal level, it's about recreating or creating genuine communities that are in contact with each other. And I think that's one of the problems that we all suffer from in many modern societies, is that we lack that infrastructure of the community which allows us to have this exchange. So I think there's a wider issue which I'd just like to say.
The inspiration that you've given about education and loving compassion as we reach out to each other, that is wonderful. But I've been sitting thinking that the demonization occurs when our media highlight what is the evil and not the good. So I just have a straight question really about all the moderates and all the beautiful people that exist in the Islamic faith, and what are the proportions in the world about those versus the others? Anybody got any information on that?
We had a woman in our community for a number of years sorely lamented. That's Janine Evans, who moved with her family to Cape Town, South Africa, a couple of years ago, who was part of the Muslim community, and who would bewail the fact that it was impossible to get the media to cover positive events in the Muslim community. That there just wasn't that media interest. I mean, I could say that from the perspective of the Jewish community. We have the same problem. When that we have, it doesn't make good copy, I guess, to have a good news story. But I think there's more discrimination against these good news stories in the Muslim community than there are in the larger community, which I think you're absolutely right that adds to that image. And she also shared stories of having grant applications refused, of people applying for positions who had more difficulty gaining employment, and just all kinds of very, very frustrating and disturbing experiences of people who were experiencing discrimination, presumably because they were Muslims.
Well, I think what you've got to understand is a political battle taking place within the Islamic world, inside the Islamic world. It's not a question of majority and minorities. It's a battle about essentially the soul of Islam. And it's a political battle. It's not a religious one. It's not being fought on the level of faith. It's being fought at the level of power struggles. And when we think about the Western media, we also have to think, of course, of the media inside the Islamic world as well. And the media in many parts of the Islamic world is not particularly progressive. We know that there are, at the moment, extremely bad relations between Muslims and Christians in Egypt. We know there are very bad relations between Muslims and Christians in Pakistan. These are not countries where the average person is hostile, but where certain sections of the population are able to whip up terrible acts of violence against the other. And so that underlines how serious this political battle which is taking place actually is. And I do think, therefore, one has to be extremely careful of the kind of simple idea which many of our politicians have, that there are a majority of moderates and a tiny number of extremists. This is very much the kind of view of, for instance, Tony Blair and his Faith Foundation about Muslims, for example. There is this real struggle taking place, and that's why it's important that we need to have an openness of dialogue and to try to have foreign policy and interfaith relations which try to isolate those with political ideas which in fact endanger both good relations, but also, in my view, endanger the whole soul of Islam. Thank you.
And for you to discuss amongst yourselves some of the jewels you have heard from each other tonight. So, please.
Well, I want to thank John for framing this battle within Islam as a political battle. I think that's really, really useful to see it in that way. Although I think it's then reframed as a religious battle for the soul of Islam, and so that's very useful to me in an international context. I mean, my personal little pearl is this idea that I'm guessing the vast majority of Australians know next to nothing about Islam, may not know that much about Judaism either, and so I think there's a huge need for a greater level of education about other faith traditions as a pathway to embracing our identity as a multicultural society, and that's something that unfortunately, as I understand it, with a national curriculum, it's even that much more difficult to bring that into the education system. But I think it's so crucial to have that understanding and appreciation of each other.
I guess I'll be taking away from tonight a deeper commitment for my time being moderator in the Uniting Church to institute some conversations amongst women of various faiths here in Adelaide. And so it's been something that I've been thinking about, and coming here tonight it's kind of strengthened my commitment to that, because I think it is in relationships with one another that we begin to build those kinds of human communities. So that's what I'm taking away from tonight.
I guess, John, what I was thinking about, and obviously I love to innovate, I would respond to is this setting a new agenda, and to step out. And that's why I said what I said about theological colleges, to think about the things that are the planks of from within a Christian perspective, what are the planks that are important to us, and ask, so now how can we bring the other with us into that plank, whether it be in leadership formation, which I think is critical in terms of setting the new agenda, and Deirdre, what you said about education, which ties in with, I think, what you were saying too, Shoshana, about how can we share lives, really, because it's not just information, is it? There's an effective domain. There's a whole lot of aspects to that. So I think what I take away and encourage to look at this question of setting the new agenda for a community of difference that is able to cohere and to be together humanly.
Well, I suppose what I take away that is the openness of the other panelists, and indeed of the questions, to setting this new agenda. And I think that's the very important question, that we have it in our power, if we want, within our communities, to do that we don't have to be held hostage to a rather binary view of what the world is, that the opportunities for getting rid of good versus evil, which has been the tendency in this whole discussion about Islam, not just from September the 11th, but also, as Shoshana pointed out before, and not really since 1979, but as a matter of fact going right back to the Crusades, as a matter of fact. So that we've got a lot of history, a lot of baggage to deal with. But I think that what was interesting from this discussion is that there's the energy perhaps to deal with it now, and that is very important.